Most people think inflation is a mistake, a bad policy, a failed economy, something governments desperately try to stop. But what if that's only half the story? What if a world with zero inflation is actually a nightmare for governments, not because prices stay low, but because the entire financial system starts to break in ways most people never see? That sounds backwards. After all, who wouldn't want groceries, rent, and gas to stop getting more expensive? The answer is surprisingly simple. Governments don't just manage prices, they manage debt. And once you understand that, inflation starts looking less like an accident and more like a tool. Right now, nearly every major economy carries enormous amounts of debt. The United States owes tens of trillions of dollars. Japan owes even more relative to the size of its economy. Many European countries also carry massive government debt. At first glance, this seems impossible. How can countries owe so much money without collapsing? The answer lies in time. Governments rarely pay off debt the way families pay off a mortgage. Instead, they constantly refinance it. Old debt becomes new debt. The system keeps rolling forward. As long as investors keep lending, everything appears stable. But there's another trick hiding underneath. Inflation quietly changes the value of money itself. Imagine you borrow $100 today. 10 years later, you still owe $100. But if prices have doubled over those 10 years, that $100 buys far less than it used to. You repay the same number of dollars, but each dollar is worth less. In other words, inflation slowly shrinks the real burden of debt without changing the number printed on the loan. It's like carrying a heavy backpack while gravity slowly gets weaker every year. The backpack hasn't changed, but it feels lighter. Now imagine this happening across an entire country. Governments borrow huge amounts during recessions, wars, pandemics, or financial crises. Those debts don't disappear, but moderate inflation helps make them easier to manage over time. That's one reason central banks often aim for around 2% inflation instead of zero, not because rising prices are enjoyable, but because completely stable prices can create even bigger problems. History offers a powerful example. During the Great Depression, prices actually fell. That sounds like good news: cheaper food, cheaper products, lower prices everywhere. But something dangerous happened. Debt became harder to repay. People lost jobs, businesses earned less money, yet the amount they owed stayed exactly the same. Every dollar of debt became heavier. Bankruptcies exploded, banks failed, the economy spiraled downward. Falling prices may sound wonderful, but when debt is everywhere, deflation can become devastating. That's why central banks often fear deflation even more than moderate inflation. Now here's where things become uncomfortable. Inflation doesn't affect everyone equally. If your wages rise as fast as prices, you might stay roughly in the same position. If your investments grow faster than inflation, you may even become wealthier. But if your savings sit in cash while prices keep climbing, your purchasing power quietly disappears. No one takes money directly from your wallet. It simply buys less every year. It's one of the few financial forces people experience almost daily without fully noticing. This creates a strange political reality. Most voters dislike inflation, and politicians publicly promise to fight it. Yet eliminating inflation completely could increase unemployment, trigger falling wages, and make government debt much harder to manage.
The solution many policymakers prefer isn't zero inflation, it's controlled inflation. Enough to keep the economy moving, not enough to cause panic. At least that's the goal. Of course, keeping inflation under control is much harder than it sounds. Once people expect prices to keep rising, businesses raise prices faster, workers demand higher wages, companies face higher costs. Those higher costs lead to even higher prices. The cycle feeds itself. That's why inflation can suddenly accelerate if confidence is lost. We've seen this happen in different countries throughout history. Sometimes governments printed far too much money, sometimes supply chains collapsed, sometimes energy prices exploded. Different causes, same result. Prices moved faster than wages, savings lost value, trust weakened. Stopping that kind of inflation often requires painful decisions: higher interest rates, slower borrowing, lower spending, and sometimes even recessions. It's a reminder that inflation is useful only when it's small and predictable. Beyond that point, it becomes destructive. So governments constantly walk a tightrope. Too little inflation and debt becomes heavier while economic growth slows. Too much inflation and confidence in money itself begins to disappear. Neither outcome is attractive. This is why debates about inflation are rarely just about grocery bills. They're really debates about debt, growth, employment, political stability, and how modern economies survive while carrying enormous financial obligations. The next time you hear that inflation has risen by 1 or 2%, remember that you're not just hearing about prices, you're hearing about one of the most powerful balancing acts in the global economy. Because behind every inflation report is a much bigger question. If governments truly wanted prices to never rise again, would the financial system they built still be able to survive?